Case number 1, Richard Ramirez.
Why on earth would you have hurt those people? Why did you kill those people?
No comments.
Richard Ramirez was arrested in 1985 and accused of 13 serial killings that terrorized Southern California. Jury selection for the trial lasted 6 months. Ramirez is 28 years old and a self-proclaimed devil worshiper.
By the summer of 1985, Southern California had spent more than a year living with an unidentified predator. He entered homes through unlocked windows and doors in the middle of the night, killing and assaulting people in their beds, occasionally forcing victims to swear allegiance to Satan before he attacked them. He left pentagrams drawn in blood on walls, gouged out a victim's eyes, and moved without any consistent pattern, striking men, women, the elderly, and at least one child. Early on, when his attacks were concentrated in the San Fernando Valley, newspapers called him the Valley Intruder. When he shifted north to San Francisco and struck at night with no clear pattern of entry, the name changed to the Night Stalker. On August 31st, 1985, after his photograph had run on every local news broadcast for days, a group of residents in East Los Angeles recognized his face, chased him down as he tried to steal a car, and beat him before police arrived to pull him out and take him into custody. His name was Richard Ramirez. Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children. His father, a former Mexican police officer who had emigrated to the United States and taken work as a railroad man, was violent and unpredictable at home, and Ramirez often slept in a nearby cemetery to avoid him. As a boy, he was drawn into the orbit of an older cousin, Miguel Ramirez, a decorated Green Beret recently home from Vietnam, who showed him photographs documenting killings he claimed to have carried out overseas, and told him, according to Ramirez's own later account, that having power over life and death felt godlike. In May 1973, when Ramirez was 13, he watched Miguel shoot and kill his wife during an argument, the blood landing on his face. Miguel was found not guilty by reason of insanity, attributed to combat-related trauma, and spent 4 years in a Texas state mental hospital. By his teenage years, Ramirez was using LSD heavily, practicing forms of Satanism, and working as a hotel night clerk, a job that gave him a master key he used to slip into guests' rooms and steal from them while they slept. Ramirez's killings, later traced back as far as 1984, spanned the greater Los Angeles area and eventually the San Francisco Bay Area. Among his confirmed victims were Dale Okazaki and Cy Leon Yu, both killed the same night in March 1985, and an elderly couple, Vincent and Maxine Zazara, murdered days later in an attack in which Ramirez mutilated Maxine's body after killing her husband. In July 1985, he attacked 16-year-old Whitney Bennett with a tire iron inside her own home, leaving her critically injured but alive. One of the survivors, whose testimony and description of his shoe print eventually helped detectives connect the string of attacks to a single assailant. By the time of his capture that August, he faced 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries, with victims ranging from their early 30s to 84 years old. In 2009, NA evidence would also connect him to the unsolved 1984 killing of a 9-year-old girl in San Francisco, a case for which he was never formally charged. Investigators also later noted that in 1983, before his killing spree escalated, Ramirez had traveled to San Francisco specifically to meet Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, an encounter LaVey himself described afterward as unremarkable. At his first court appearance in October 1985, Ramirez turned to face the courtroom, raised a hand with a pentagram and the number 666 drawn on his palm, and shouted "Hail Satan" as he was led out. He repeated the display, along with a rambling statement invoking Satanism and declaring himself beyond good and evil, when he was formally sentenced to death in November 1989, following a trial that had cost Los Angeles County more than $1.8 million, a record at the time. Jurors later said the sheer range of his victims, from young women to elderly couples, and the satanic symbolism left at several scenes, made the decision to recommend death straightforward despite the trial's length. By the time he arrived on San Quentin's death row at the close of 1989, Ramirez had already built the reputation that would define his decades there. He remained defiant toward guards, was involved in physical altercations during routine cell extractions, and never expressed remorse for his crimes, at one point telling reporters outside the courtroom that death simply went with the territory and that he expected to see them again in Disneyland. Because of the notoriety surrounding the Night Stalker case, he also received a steady stream of admiring mail from women outside the prison, and in October 1996, he married one of them, journalist Doreen Leoy, in a ceremony held in the prison's visiting room, having corresponded with her for years before the wedding. For close to 24 years, California's legal system worked through a lengthy series of automatic appeals required in every death penalty case, appeals that moved slowly enough that his health began failing before any of them concluded. On June 7, 2013, Ramirez died at Marin General Hospital, a short distance from the prison, from complications of B-cell lymphoma, still on death row. Having never been executed, one of dozens of condemned inmates over the decades who would die of natural causes at San Quentin long before the state carried out their sentences. Case number 2. Tyler Bingham. Tyler Bingham did not need to escape a prison to be dangerous. He used the prison system itself as his headquarters, and for years he did it from inside the same facility built to stop men exactly like him. As one of the ranking leaders of the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang founded at California's San Quentin in the 1960s, Bingham helped direct a criminal enterprise tied to dozens of murders and attempted murders across the federal system, coordinating much of it while confined to ADX Florence's most restrictive housing. Bingham's life before prison is by design one of the thinnest records in this episode. Court filings and reporting on the case describe him entering the federal system as a young man convicted of comparatively minor property crime, with none of the public record of a cartel empire or a documented childhood that defines most of the other cases here. What is known is that once inside, he found the structure he had not found on the outside. He rose through the Aryan Brotherhood's ranks quickly enough that by the 1980s, still a relatively young inmate, he was named to the gang's three-man federal commission alongside Barry Mills, placing him at the top of an organization with no legitimate outlet for his ambition except the prison system itself. The gang had originally formed among white inmates at San Quentin, seeking protection along racial lines inside California's increasingly divided prison population. But by the time Bingham rose through its ranks, it had evolved into something closer to an organized crime syndicate, controlling drug distribution and extorting protection payments across multiple state and federal systems. By the 1990s, Bingham, along with fellow Aryan Brotherhood leader Barry Mills, was already held in extreme isolation at ADX Florence. The Bureau of Prisons had concluded that placing its most dangerous gang leadership in permanent solitary confinement would sever their ability to run operations from a distance. It did not work the way anyone intended. Investigators would later testify that some cooperating informants housed in a separate unit of the same facility lived in far more comfortable conditions, with access to laptops and outside food, in exchange for their testimony, a detail that became a point of contention at trial. Bingham and Mills, held under stricter conditions, found their own workaround. In 1997, federal investigators allege Bingham smuggled out a message written in invisible ink made from urine, addressed to Aryan Brotherhood members at USP Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. When heated over a flame, the message revealed instructions that prosecutors would later characterize as a declaration of war against a rival group, D.C. Blacks. Within days of the note's arrival at Lewisburg, 2 black inmates were stabbed to death in a coordinated attack carried out by Aryan Brotherhood members inside the facility. The Aryan Brotherhood operated on a structure prosecutors compared directly to a mafia commission, a small governing council making decisions that street-level members and prison-based soldiers were expected to carry out without question. Refusal or perceived disloyalty carried a death sentence enforced by the gang itself, not the courts. By the time federal investigators moved against the organization, they attributed dozens of murders and attempted murders across the federal system to orders that had passed through leaders like Bingham and Mills, including the killings of inmates Frank Joyner and Abdul Salam. both charged against Bingham as violent crimes carried out in aid of the racketeering enterprise. For nearly a decade afterward, federal prosecutors built a sweeping racketeering case against the gang's national leadership structure, eventually charging 40 defendants under the same statute originally written to dismantle organized crime families. 19 of those defendants struck plea deals before trial rather than risk a federal jury. Bingham was among the first 4 to actually stand trial in Santa Ana, California, in a proceeding that ran 5 months and drew on 6 years of intercepted mail, recorded prison phone calls, and testimony from former gang members who had turned informant. In July 2006, a jury convicted Bingham of racketeering and of the 1989 murder of fellow inmate Arva Lee Ray at Lompoc Penitentiary, a killing prosecutors said was ordered after Ray was accused of violating the gang's internal code by openly maintaining a relationship with another man and mishandling drug proceeds. Bingham was acquitted on a separate murder charge tied to inmate William McKinney. Prosecutors pursued the death penalty against both Bingham and Mills, but the jury deadlocked during the penalty phase, and both men were sentenced instead to life without the possibility of parole. Co-defendants Edgar Hevley and Christopher Gibson, convicted in the same trial of conspiracy in the Lewisburg killings, received 3 consecutive life sentences and 20 years to life respectively. Bingham appealed his conviction to the Ninth Circuit, arguing the racketeering charges and evidence had been improperly combined, but the appellate court affirmed his conviction and sentence in 2011, closing off his last realistic avenue to overturn the case. After sentencing, Bingham was sent back to ADX Florence, this time under a system that had already watched him operate from inside its walls once and had no intention of allowing a repeat. Prison officials tightened mail screening protocols across the facility and closed the specific gap that had let a coded, chemically treated note travel 2,000 miles between cells without detection. Barry Mills remained at ADX Florence until his death in July 2018, one day after his 70th birthday, having spent the last years of his life in the same restrictive housing where his and Bingham's operation had once run undetected. What separates Bingham's file from most Supermax placements is that ADX Florence did not stop him on the first attempt. It took a coordinated, multi-year federal investigation, a 40-defendant racketeering indictment, and a 5-month trial to finally close the loopholes his operation depended on. The concrete alone was never enough. It was the combination of total isolation and, eventually, total surveillance that ended his ability to give an order that anyone outside his cell would ever receive again. Case number 3, Charles N.G.
We, the jury in the above entitled case, find the defendant, Charles Cheetah Ng, guilty of the murder of Harvey Dubbs, guilty of the murder of Michael Carroll, as charged in count 3. We further find the murder to be of the first degree.
The case that would expose one of California's largest known killing operations began, almost accidentally, with a stolen tool. On June 2, 1985, at a hardware store in South San Francisco, an employee caught a young man attempting to shoplift a vis. The man ran, but his companion, waiting outside, drove back to the store and tried to pay for the item, unaware that police had already been called. That companion was Leonard Lake, and when officers checked his identification, they found he was carrying the driver's license of a man who had been reported missing weeks earlier. A handgun fitted with a silencer was found in his car. Lake was arrested on the spot, and while in custody, he swallowed a cyanide capsule he had sewn into his own clothing in preparation for exactly this moment. He died 4 days later without ever being formally questioned about what investigators would soon find. The man who had fled the hardware store was Charles Ng, a former United States Marine. NG had been born in Hong Kong in 1960, the son of a wealthy executive, and had a difficult, strictly disciplined childhood that included expulsions from multiple schools for theft, both in Hong Kong and later at a boarding school in England. After moving to the United States on a student visa, he enlisted in the Marine Corps using falsified documents, since he was not an American citizen, and within a year was caught stealing thousands of dollars in weapons from a base armory in Hawaii. He escaped custody in 1980, made his way back to Northern California, was eventually recaptured and court-martialed, and served time in a military prison before his release. It was after this that he reconnected with Leonard Lake, a fellow former Marine and self-described survivalist, at a remote cabin property Lake had built in Wilseyville, in the Sierra Nevada foothills, roughly 150 miles east of San Francisco, complete with a concrete bunker built into the hillside behind the main structure. Lake's arrest and the license plate on the car he was driving, registered to a man who had vanished the previous November, led investigators directly to the Wilseyville property. There, searchers began uncovering human remains, personal identification belonging to multiple missing people, and videotapes the two men had made documenting women held captive on the property before their deaths. Evidence that would later prove central to the trial, despite being some of the most difficult material investigators on the case ever had to review. Lake's own diary, also recovered from the property, described a plan he called Operation Miranda, under which he intended to build a self-sufficient bunker stocked with kidnapped women to serve as what he called breeders in the event of nuclear war. Investigators eventually linked Lake and Eng to as many as 25 victims, men taken largely for their vehicles and belongings, women held for weeks of sexual abuse before being killed, and at least 2 infant boys among the dead, though only 11 murders were ultimately proven against Eng at trial. Eng, meanwhile, had already fled the country. On July 6, 1985, more than a month after Lake's death, he was arrested in Calgary, Alberta, after a security guard at a Hudson's Bay department store caught him shoplifting a can of salmon and other groceries, and Eng shot the guard in the hand while resisting arrest. Canadian authorities convicted him locally on shoplifting and assault charges and sentenced him to 4.5 years, and it took nearly 6 more years of legal fighting, largely because Canada does not extradite defendants to face the death penalty, before the Supreme Court of Canada ruled 4-3 against Ng's final appeal, and he was returned to California in 1991. His trial did not begin for another 7 years. Ng spent much of that time cycling through 10 different attorneys, filing a stream of pretrial motions over issues as minor as the temperature of his food and his right to practice origami in his cell, and eventually representing himself for a period while he researched the relevant law, delays that pushed the case to trial only in October 1998. It became, at roughly $20 million, the most expensive criminal trial in California history at the time, exceeding even the O.J. Simpson case, which had cost around $9 million. In February 1999, a jury convicted Eng of 11 counts of first-degree murder, acquitting him on a 12th count despite evidence he had driven that victim's car for 7 months after the man disappeared. A judge sentenced him to death, rejecting arguments that he had acted under Lake's domination. He was sent to San Quentin's death row, where he remained for years afterward, filing appeal after appeal. In July 2022, the California Supreme Court unanimously upheld his conviction and sentence, closing off most of his remaining state-level challenges. But by 2024, California's broader restructuring of its death row moved Eng, along with hundreds of other condemned inmates, out of San Quentin entirely as the state phases out the unit and disperses its remaining population across other high-security prisons, ending his residency at the facility that had held him for more than 2 decades. Case number 4, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev.
We're 2 years after the bombing at the marathon killed in Maine among a crowd of innocent spectators. These the faces of the 3 lives taken in that moment and the police officer gunned down after. Today, the surviving bomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, was found guilty on all charges. The defense never disputed his guilt, and now their biggest fight comes next.
Dzhokhar Tsarnaev represents a category of threat that has little to do with physical violence inside prison walls. He was born on July 22, 1993, in Kyrgyzstan, the youngest child of an ethnic Chechen family that had been displaced from the Caucasus for generations. His parents brought him and his older brother, Tamerlan, first to the Russian Republic of Dagestan, and then, in 2002, to the United States on a tourist visa. seeking asylum from the violence that had followed Chechen families across Central Asia. The family settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and by most accounts of neighbors, teachers, and classmates, Dzhokhar assimilated easily. He enrolled at Cambridge Ringe in Latin school, became a popular student known for his sense of humor, made the wrestling team, and was eventually named a team captain. He later enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth and became a naturalized United States citizen in September 2012, 7 months before the bombing. Investigators and journalists who reconstructed his final years would point to his older brother's growing religious extremism and his family's economic decline as the backdrop against which Tsarnaev, by then in his final year of college, was drawn into the plot that would end his life outside of prison at 19 years old. On April 15, 2013, Tsarnaev and Tamerlan detonated 2 pressure cooker bombs near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 spectators and injuring more than 250 others, several of whom lost limbs. 4 days later, the brothers killed a Massachusetts Institute of Technology police officer and engaged in a firefight with police in Watertown, during which Tamerlan was shot and then run over by his brother's escaping vehicle, dying of his injuries shortly after. The manhunt that followed shut down the greater Boston area for nearly a full day, with residents ordered to shelter in place while thousands of law enforcement officers searched door to door. Dzhokhar was eventually found hiding inside a covered boat parked in a Watertown backyard, wounded and unarmed. He was convicted on all 30 charges against him in April 2015 and sentenced to death that June. During the penalty phase of his trial, his defense team argued that Tsarnaev had acted under the influence of his older brother, portraying Tamerlan as the driving force behind the attack and Dzhokhar as a younger, more impressionable participant, an argument the jury ultimately did not accept as grounds to spare his life. He was sent to ADX Florence to await an appeals process that, more than a decade later, still has not concluded. The legal fight over his sentence has been unusually long, even by federal death penalty standards. In 2020, the First Circuit Court of Appeals vacated his death sentence, ruling that the trial judge had failed to adequately screen jurors for pretrial bias and had wrongly excluded evidence the defense argued was relevant to Tsarnaev's culpability relative to his brother. The Supreme Court reversed that decision in March 2022, reinstating the death sentence and ruling that Tsarnaev had received a fair trial. His legal team has continued to challenge the outcome since. In March 2024, a federal appeals panel ordered the trial judge to investigate renewed claims that 2 seated jurors had concealed relevant information during jury selection, a question that, as of this recording, remains unresolved and has been the subject of sealed filings and a contested recusal motion against the presiding judge. In December 2024, President Biden commuted the sentences of 37 of the 40 men then held on federal death row. Tsarnaev was one of only 3 whose sentence was left standing. In February 2025, the federal execution moratorium that had been in place was formally lifted, though Tsarnaev's still active appeals mean no execution date can be set until those proceedings are resolved one way or another. Inside ADX Florence, Tsarnaev's confinement is built around a single objective, preventing him from becoming an ideological figurehead. Federal officials have long treated high-profile extremists as a distinct category of risk, separate from ordinary violent offenders, on the theory that a prisoner does not need physical freedom to radicalize others. Correspondence, media access, or even indirect public statements filtered out through legal channels can, in theory, sustain influence over sympathizers on the outside or inspire copycat attacks. Tsarnaev's mail, reading material, and any communication with the outside world are subject to restrictions well beyond those applied to most inmates at the facility, and his access to coverage of his own ongoing case is tightly controlled by prison officials. He shares the facility with a small number of other men convicted of large-scale terrorism and espionage, including Ted Kaczynski's former unit and Ramzi Youssef, the architect of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Housing these men together, all under nearly identical restrictions, is itself a deliberate strategy. It denies any one of them a captive audience of lower security inmates who might carry radicalized ideas back into general population once released, since no one housed near them will ever be transferred anywhere else. The federal government's approach to this small group of prisoners has stayed remarkably consistent since ADX Florence opened, regardless of the individual ideology involved. Kaczynski mailed bombs to strangers over nearly 2 decades while evading identification. Yusef helped plan an attack intended to topple one tower of the World Trade Center into the other. Tsarnaev live-streamed nothing and issued no manifesto, yet the facility treats his case with the same procedural weight, restricting outgoing statements not because of what he has said, but because of what federal officials believe he could still say if given the opening. More than a decade after the bombing, Tsarnaev's case remains legally unresolved in a way almost no other inmate at ADX Florence can claim. Guzman's cartel is broken. Bingham's channel to Lewisburg was found and permanently closed. Conway's sentence is final and unappealed. Tsarnaev's death sentence, by contrast, continues to move through the federal court system, vacated once, reinstated once, and now under renewed scrutiny. All while he sits inside a cell built to make sure that whatever the courts eventually decide, his voice never travels beyond it in the meantime. Case number 5. Stanley Tookie Williams.
The unofficial time of death for condemned inmate Stanley Williams is 12:35 p.m. We will have an official time of death when the warden arrives to give a brief statement.
On the night of December 12, 2005, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger issued a written statement denying clemency to Stanley Tookie Williams, ending a campaign that had drawn in Hollywood celebrities, international human rights groups, and multiple Nobel Peace Prize nominations on Williams' behalf. Just after midnight the following morning, he was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin, among the most publicly contested executions California had carried out in decades. Williams was born on December 29, 1953, in New Orleans, and moved with his mother to South Central Los Angeles by bus in 1959, when he was 5. He grew into a physically imposing teenager who took up competitive weightlifting, and in 1971, alongside a high school friend named Raymond Washington, he helped found the Crips, initially framed among its earliest members as protection from rival groups in the neighborhood. Under Williams's influence through the 1970s, the Loose Alliance expanded into a much larger and more violent network spanning multiple Los Angeles neighborhoods, a growth prosecutors would later tie directly to his physical presence and reputation on the street, even as Raymond Washington, the group's other founder, was murdered by a rival gang member in 1979 and never lived to see the Crips become the sprawling, multi-state organization it did. In February 1979, prosecutors said Williams and 3 associates, high on PCP, drove to an industrial area east of Los Angeles looking for a place to rob, and Williams shot and killed a convenience store clerk named Albert Owens during the robbery, which netted about $120, firing 2 shots into Owens' back after making him lie on the floor. 2 weeks later, prosecutors said Williams broke into the office of a motel in South Central Los Angeles and killed the immigrant family that ran it, Yena Yang, his wife Tsai Shai Yang, and their adult daughter Yi Chen Lin, all originally from Taiwan. Williams denied committing any of the 4 murders for the rest of his life, and his defense pointed out that the case against him relied heavily on testimony from accomplices and a jailhouse informant, each of whom received reduced sentences or other benefits in exchange for cooperating, along with the fact that only 1 black juror was seated on the panel that convicted him. Convicted in 1981 and sentenced to death, Williams spent his early years on death row still deeply connected to gang life, and prison officials later cited him in connection with violent power struggles among incarcerated gang factions. That changed in the mid-1990s when, largely in isolation, he began writing a series of children's books warning against gang violence and corresponding with young readers, teachers, and activists on the outside. The transformation made him a cause celebre. Celebrities including Snoop Dogg and Jamie Foxx publicly lobbied for his life, and his case became a national referendum on whether redemption inside prison should count for anything against a death sentence already handed down. Prosecutors and the victims' families argued the opposite, pointing out that Williams had never confessed to the killings and had refused to provide investigators any information on the gang he had built, which they said undercut the sincerity of his claimed reform. Williams' legal team spent years pursuing appeals, and in 2004, a federal appeals court, while ultimately upholding his conviction, noted that his conduct and accomplishments in prison might make him a credible candidate for clemency, a rare acknowledgement that helped fuel the campaign in his final years. In the days before his execution, his attorneys filed a series of last-minute petitions citing new witnesses who claimed the case against him had been fabricated, all of which were rejected by the California Supreme Court, the federal courts, and finally, the United States Supreme Court. Schwarzenegger's denial of clemency centered on the same core issue that had defined the case for years, stating in his written decision that without an admission of guilt, there could be no genuine atonement for the 4 murders, regardless of what Williams had accomplished since. On the night of the execution, Williams offered no resistance as he was strapped to the gurney. Execution staff spent roughly 12 minutes locating a usable vein in his muscular arm, a delay witnesses in the room described as unusually difficult even by the standards of the procedure, before he was pronounced dead at 12:35 a.m. On December 13, 2005, 25 years after he first arrived at San Quentin. He had published 9 children's books during his time on death row, several of them still in print years after his execution, though critics at the time questioned how widely they were actually read outside the campaign built around his case. His execution remains one of the last carried out at the prison before Governor Newsom imposed a formal moratorium on executions in 2019, and it continues to be cited on both sides of the death penalty debate, by opponents as an example of the system executing a demonstrably changed man, and by prosecutors and victims' families as proof that reform without accountability should never be enough to overturn a jury's verdict. Case number 6. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman.
6 months ago, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman escaped from the most secure prison in Mexico. This surveillance video shows his last moments in his cell before he walks into his shower stall. That's when he climbed into this mile-long tunnel where he hopped on a retrofitted motorcycle and rode these tracks to freedom. This was his second escape from prison. El Chapo, which means shorty, may be just 5'6", but he was also one of the biggest and most violent drug lords in the world. He's run the notorious Sinaloa drug cartel, worth about $3 billion. The cartel is responsible for much of the violence that has plagued the streets in parts of Mexico.
Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was never supposed to be contained by standard architecture. As the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, his wealth did not just buy weapons, it bought infrastructure. He was born Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera on April 4, 1957, the oldest of 7 children in La Tuna, a remote farming settlement in the Sinaloa mountains where opium poppies were the region's main cash crop. His father worked the land and, by most accounts, was physically abusive, and Guzman would later describe an upbringing built on farm labor and beatings rather than schooling. From a young age, he sold oranges to help support the family, and reportedly showed an early fixation on money, counting whatever cash came his way. In his mid-teens, he began growing his own small marijuana plot with cousins, and by his late teens, he had left La Tuna for good, taking a job as a driver and logistics runner for Sinaloa trafficker Hector Palma, before rising through the organization run by Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. When Gallardo was arrested in 1989, Guzman used the opening to found his own operation, laying the groundwork for what would become the Sinaloa cartel. He was first captured in Guatemala in 1993, extradited to Mexico, and sentenced to 20 years for murder and drug trafficking. In 1995, he was transferred to Puente Grande, a facility officially classified as maximum security. What happened inside told a different story. Guzman received regular visits from his wife, his brother, and cartel associates. He kept a mobile phone. According to testimony later given at his New York trial, he was supplied with new shoes, wine, and food brought in from outside, and was allowed drives beyond the prison walls whenever he requested them. Puente Grande did not contain Guzman. It employed him. On January 19, 2001, Guzman walked out. According to the most widely corroborated account, a guard on his payroll, Francisco Camberos Rivera, known as El Chito, opened his cell in the middle of the night and helped him climb into a cart loaded with dirty laundry. Guzman later told an associate, who testified to it years later in court, that he counted the clicks of the cart's wheels against the floor tiles to track how far they had traveled through the building. The cart passed through electronic doors that had been left open and hallways that had been left unguarded. At the final checkpoint, the guard let the cart roll ahead of him alone, and Guzman lay still inside it, certain that if it tipped over, the escape would end there. It did not. He was driven out of the compound in a laundry truck and vanished. In the investigation that followed, Mexican authorities implicated dozens of prison staff, including senior officials, in the breakout. Guzman spent the next 13 years as a fugitive, and in that time the Sinaloa Cartel grew into one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world, responsible for a significant share of narcotics entering the United States. He was recaptured in February 2014. In July 2015, he did the impossible a second time, and did it from a prison built to be a near copy of the one he had already escaped. Engineers working for the cartel spent months digging a tunnel more than a mile long beneath Altiplano Federal Prison. It was ventilated, wired for lighting, and fitted with a modified motorcycle running on rails to move equipment through it. The shaft opened directly into the shower stall attached to his cell. Investigators later theorized that the same corrupt former security official who helped plan his 2001 escape may have supplied blueprints for Altiplano as well, since the two prisons were built within a few years of each other and shared a nearly identical layout. Guzman disappeared through the floor of his own bathroom while guards patrolled the corridor above him. He was recaptured for the final time in January 2016. A little over a year later, in January 2017, Mexico extradited him to the United States, and by the time American prosecutors had him in custody, they already understood that ordinary confinement meant nothing to this particular inmate. He was held pre-trial under special administrative measures, known as SAMs, a designation reserved for prisoners considered capable of directing violence or criminal enterprise from behind bars. In February 2019, a Brooklyn jury convicted him on all counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, the same charge once used against major organized crime bosses. In July of that year, he was sentenced to life, plus 30 years, and sent to ADX Florence, where the restrictions that had governed his pretrial detention became permanent. Under SAMs, Guzman has no contact with other inmates whatsoever. His legal mail and calls are screened by federal monitors before reaching him. His single hour of daily recreation takes place inside a small, high-walled concrete enclosure with a narrow mesh opening to the sky, the only glimpse of the outside world the facility allows him. There is no laundry cart at ADX Florence. There is no tunnel to dig, and no shower stall connected to anything but a drain built into solid rock. The facility does not try to out-engineer a man who has already beaten two different maximum security prisons. It removes the variable he depended on both times: freedom of movement and the ability to communicate. Everything else follows from that. At his New York trial, prosecutors laid out the scale of what SAMs was actually built to contain. Witnesses described a trafficking operation responsible for smuggling hundreds of tons of cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin into the United States over roughly 2 decades, generating billions of dollars for the Sinaloa Cartel and its allies. By 2013, the city of Chicago's own crime commission had named Guzman its public enemy number 1, a designation the city had not used since Al Capone. That reach is precisely what special administrative measures are designed to sever. A standard maximum security sentence assumes that a prisoner's influence ends at the prison gate. SAMs assumes the opposite, that for a small number of inmates, the sentence itself means nothing unless every possible channel back to the outside world is closed at the same time. The man who evaded the combined law enforcement resources of 2 nations for over a decade, who turned 2 separate high-security prisons into personal headquarters, now lives inside a single poured concrete bunk. His fortune, his cartel, and his voice have all been reduced to the same outcome: a permanent and total severance from the world he once ran from a cell. Case number 7. Charles Manson.
1969, Manson's so-called family, a group of dropouts, drifters, and burned-out hippies, murdered 7 people in 2 separate attacks in Los Angeles. They acted on Manson's orders.
Maybe I should have killed 400 or 500 people, then I would have felt better. Then when I felt like I really offered society something. You know, if I wanted to kill somebody, I'd take this book and beat you to death with it, and I wouldn't feel a thing. It'd be just like walking to the drugstore.
On April 22, 1971, Charles Manson was transferred from Los Angeles County Jail to San Quentin State Prison to begin serving a death sentence. He stood 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed barely more than 100 pounds, and prison staff who had processed far larger and more physically imposing men treated his arrival with unusual caution, because Manson's danger had never come from size or strength. It came from his ability to make other people do what he wanted. Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a teenage mother with a history of petty crime. His childhood moved through reform schools, foster placements, and juvenile detention, and by his early 30s, he had spent more than half his life in some form of institution, convicted along the way of offenses ranging from grand theft auto to pimping. When he was released into San Francisco's counterculture scene in 1967, he applied what he had learned inside those institutions about reading and controlling people to assemble a following of mostly young, disaffected followers who called themselves the Family, drawing many of them in through a mix of drugs, communal living, and his own claims to prophetic insight. Manson also spent time on the fringes of the Los Angeles music industry during this period, briefly befriending Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson, who let Manson and dozens of his followers live at his house for months and helped fund a demo recording session that went nowhere. By 1969, the family had settled at Spawn Ranch, a rundown movie set outside Los Angeles, where Manson preached an apocalyptic race war he called Helter Skelter, a term borrowed from a Beatles song, and told followers that violence was necessary to bring it about. In August 1969, acting on Manson's direction though not present at either scene himself, several family members carried out the murders of actress Sharon Tate and 4 others at a home in Benedict Canyon, followed the next night by the murders of grocery store owners Leno and Rosemary LaBianca at their home. 7 deaths across 2 nights that prosecutors argued Manson had orchestrated to trigger the race war he believed was coming, in part by making the killings look like they had been committed by black militants. Manson was convicted in a separate 1971 trial of 2 additional murders of family associate Gary Hinman and ranch hand Donald Shea, both killed in the weeks surrounding the Tate and LaBianca attacks. Manson's trial for the Tate and LaBianca murders began in the summer of 1970 and ran for 9 months, becoming one of the longest and strangest criminal trials in American history. On the first day of testimony, he appeared in the courtroom with an X freshly carved into his forehead, telling reporters it meant he had crossed himself out of society's world. Several of his co-defendants copied the mark within days, and by the trial's end, most of the family members still loyal to him wore the same scar, some of them keeping a rotating vigil on the sidewalk outside the courthouse for the entire 9 months. The proceedings were disrupted further when Leslie Van Houten's attorney, Ronald Hughes, vanished during a recess and was later found dead, a death some investigators suspected, without ever proving, was tied to the family itself. Manson was convicted in January 1971 on 7 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy, sentenced to death that April, and admitted to San Quentin the same month. His death sentence lasted less than a year. In February 1972, the California Supreme Court struck down the state's death penalty statute entirely, and Manson's sentence, along with those of every other condemned inmate in California at the time, was automatically commuted to life in prison. Inside the system, Manson never stopped trying to build influence over other inmates, holding forth for hours to anyone willing to listen, and briefly finding acceptance among members of the Aryan Brotherhood, though accounts from later biographers suggest his standing within that group was never as dominant as he liked to project. He gave a small number of media interviews over the years, including a 1986 sit-down with CBS journalist Charlie Rose that won a National News Emmy, and a widely broadcast 1988 interview with Geraldo Rivera. But the violence he had once directed at others eventually found him. On September 25, 1984, while housed at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, a fellow inmate named Jan Holmstrom, reportedly angered by Manson's mockery of his Hare Krishna beliefs, doused him with paint thinner and set him on fire. Manson suffered second and third degree burns across much of his face and chest and survived, but the incident marked the end of any remaining aura of invincibility that had followed him through the prison system. He spent the following decades shuffled between California's highest security psychiatric and medical units, denied parole at every hearing he was granted, until his death from natural causes on November 19, 2017, at a hospital near Bakersfield, 46 years after he first arrived at San Quentin. Case number 8. Jesse Conway.
Jesse Conway is guilty of first-degree murder for killing corrections officer Eric Williams of Nanticoke. Conway was an inmate at the federal prison at Canaan in Wayne County when he killed Williams in February of 2013. During the two-day trial, jurors watched graphic surveillance video showing Conway attack Williams and stab him more than 200 times.
Traditional maximum security relies on an unwritten assumption that inmates, whatever their history, will not attack a corrections officer directly and without warning. Jesse Conway, a high-ranking member of the New Mexican Mafia, shattered that assumption on February 25, 2013, inside Usp Canaan in Waymart, Pennsylvania. He was born on January 17, 1977, and raised in a poor neighborhood of Manila in the Philippines. Around 1986, his mother married a United States serviceman, and the family relocated to Rome, New York, where Conway, still a child, had to adjust to an entirely new country and language. According to his own defense attorneys, he showed early promise in his new home before drifting into drugs, alcohol, and petty crime in his teenage years, a slide that landed him in juvenile custody. By the late 1990s, he was serving time in the Arizona state prison system for a string of car thefts, and it was there that he first built ties to the New Mexican Mafia, a prison gang with a strict, violence-enforced internal hierarchy. He was released in 2001, but the gang connections he had made behind bars followed him back into the free world. At the time of the Williams killing, Conway was not the life-sentenced inmate the public would later assume him to be. He was serving an 11-year federal sentence for conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Years earlier, in August 2002, he had committed a murder in Arizona, killing a man named Carlos Garcia, and that state case had continued moving through the courts while he served his federal drug sentence. Prison officials had already determined that once his federal time concluded, he would be transferred out of the Bureau of Prison System to begin serving 25 years to life for the Arizona killing. He was, in effect, on a countdown to a life sentence he had not yet started serving. He never got the chance to leave on those terms. Conway's affiliation with the New Mexican Mafia placed him inside a prison gang structure built around territorial control of drug distribution within correctional facilities and strict internal discipline enforced through violence. Officers who worked with him described a calculated inmate who understood exactly how far Bureau of Prison supervision extended on a housing unit, and who chose his moment for the attack on a night when Williams was covering the block without a second officer present, a staffing gap that would later draw its own scrutiny from investigators reviewing the case. On the night of the attack, Officer Eric Williams, 34 years old and originally from Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, was working the housing unit alone, preparing roughly 130 inmates for lockdown. According to prosecutors, Conway charged at him, knocked him down a flight of stairs, and attacked him with homemade shanks, stabbing him repeatedly and fracturing his skull before Williams eventually died of his injuries. Video footage of the assault, later shown to jurors, ran for 11 minutes. When another officer asked Conway why he had done it, he reportedly said that Williams had disrespected him and that he could no longer tolerate it. Investigators later determined that Conway had been planning an attack on staff for some time, and that Williams had simply been the officer working alone that night. Conway was moved to ADX Florence within days of the killing, joining a population that already included Ted Kaczynski, Ramzi Youssef, and Terry Nichols. Federal prosecutors initially sought the death penalty, a decision that dragged the case through years of pretrial litigation over jury selection and the constitutionality of capital punishment in a federal correctional murder case. Williams's parents, Don and Jean Williams, were given the choice of whether prosecutors should continue pursuing execution, and for years they supported that path, arguing publicly that a second life sentence stacked on an inmate already facing life would send no meaningful deterrent to anyone considering the same act. In 2017, on the eve of trial, Conway pleaded guilty to first-degree murder of a federal officer in exchange for prosecutors withdrawing the death penalty request. He received life without parole, a sentence that ultimately ran alongside the Arizona conviction he had been scheduled to begin serving before he ever attacked Williams. What makes Conway's file significant to how ADX Florence actually operates is what investigators found after his conviction, not before it. During later legal proceedings, prosecutors revealed that officials at ADX had discovered a piece of sharpened metal concealed inside a bar of soap in Conway's cell, evidence that even under Supermax conditions, absolute security is never guaranteed. Prosecutors used the discovery to argue that no facility eliminates risk completely. Conway did not need freedom of movement to remain dangerous. He needed only a few unmonitored seconds and a willingness to use them, and ADX Florence cannot promise those seconds will never come. What the facility guarantees instead is procedural, not architectural. Whenever Conway is moved anywhere inside the building, he travels under multiple officers and full restraints. A direct institutional response to an inmate who proved that staff cannot assume any prisoner, regardless of sentence length, will hold back. Eric Williams's murder remains one of the primary reasons federal policy now treats assaults on corrections staff as an independent threat category, separate from whatever sentence an inmate is already serving. The case also fed directly into a broader, ongoing debate over staffing levels at federal penitentiaries, since Williams had been working the unit alone that night. A practice corrections unions have argued for years leaves officers dangerously exposed, regardless of how secure a facility is on paper. Williams was not killed by a man with a life sentence and nothing left to lose. He was killed by an inmate serving 11 years who decided, over the course of a single night shift, that prison rules no longer applied to him. Case number 9. Fotios Freddy Geese.
Tonight, a former mafia hitman is reportedly the focus of the investigation into the prison murder of Whitey Bulger.
A former federal investigator told the Associated Press that Freddy Geese and at least one other inmate are suspects in the killing. Geese is a convicted killer who was tied to the mob in Springfield. WBZ's Beth Germano now has the latest.
Would it surprise you if Freddy Geese was Whitey Bulger's killer?
I'm not sure.
Fotios Geese was born on April 4, 1967, in Springfield, Massachusetts, into a Greek family, an ethnic background that would later prevent him from ever becoming a formally made member of the Italian-American mafia he spent his career serving. He and his younger brother Ty grew up in West Springfield and built a reputation as feared street enforcers from their teenage years onward, developing long criminal records for assault and violent confrontations well before either of them was tied to organized crime. By the 2000s, the brothers were working as hired muscle for Anthony Aralotta, an aspiring Springfield mob boss with ties to New York's Genovese crime family. Because they could not be formally initiated, the Geese brothers operated in a gray zone, carrying the family's authority on the street without ever holding official rank inside it. That arrangement ended in 2003, when Freddy Geese was accused of personally killing Genovese-aligned Springfield boss Adolfo Big Al Bruno and an associate, Gary Westerman, contract killings that would ultimately define the rest of his life. On October 30, 2018, James Whitey Bulger, the 89-year-old former Boston mob boss and longtime FBI informant, was transferred into the general population at USP Hazleton in West Virginia, arriving from a lower security facility in Florida where he had spent the previous 4 years. The Bureau of Prisons has never publicly explained why an 89-year-old informant with his history was placed somewhere his enemies could reach him. He did not survive 12 hours. Guards found his body beaten to death in his cell the following morning. A belt with a lock fastened to the end of it was later identified as the weapon. Bulger's own history made him a target almost anywhere in the federal system. For decades, he had led Boston's largely Irish organized crime operation while secretly feeding information to the FBI about his rivals, an arrangement that let his own operation expand, largely unchecked for years. When the relationship became public in the 1990s, Bulger fled and spent 16 years as one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives before being captured in Santa Monica, California in 2011. He was convicted in 2013 of participating in 11 murders and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years. To much of the federal prison population, and to men like Gaius in particular, Bulger was not simply a fellow inmate. He was a symbol of exactly the kind of betrayal their code existed to punish. 4 inmates were placed in solitary confinement immediately after the killing. Among them was Gaius, by then serving his life sentence for the Bruno and Westerman murders at the same facility. Investigators quickly identified him as the lead suspect in Bulger's death, alongside fellow inmate Paul DeCollegiero, with a third inmate, Sean McKinnon, accused of acting as lookout. Geiss had built his reputation as a hitman with an open, documented hatred of informants, and Bulger, whatever his own violent history, had spent decades quietly cooperating with the FBI against organized crime figures much like him. What followed was not the swift transfer to ADX Florence that popular accounts of the case often assume. Gaius remained in solitary confinement at USP Hazleton for years while federal investigators built their case, a period his family later described publicly as inhumane, noting that he spent 23 hours a day in a cement cell with almost no contact with the outside world and only 2 brief phone calls a month. It was not until August 2022, nearly 4 years after Bulger's murder, that federal prosecutors formally indicted Gaius, DeCollegiero, and McKinnon. Gaius and DeCollegiero were charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, aiding and abetting first-degree murder, and assault resulting in serious bodily injury, while McKinnon faced a separate charge of making false statements to a federal agent. Prosecutors initially left open the possibility of seeking the death penalty against Gaius, since he was already serving a life sentence and had little left to lose, before formally declining to pursue it in a later court filing. Gaius was transferred to ADX Florence in September 2023, nearly 5 years after the killing that made his name, once the scale of the case against him and the standing federal indictment had been fully established. In May 2024, after years of maintaining his innocence, Gaius reached an undisclosed plea agreement with federal prosecutors. That September, he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for prosecutors dropping the more serious first-degree murder charges, and he was sentenced to an additional 25 years to be served on top of the life sentence he was already serving for the Springfield killings. DeCollegiero and McKinnon, the 2 co-defendants transferred out of solitary confinement years earlier while the investigation continued, also reached their own plea agreements around the same time, closing out a case that had remained legally open for nearly 6 years. Geiss's file illustrates something distinct about how ADX Florence actually gets used, something the earlier cases in this episode do not. It is not simply a holding cell for inmates who commit violence inside prison walls. Placement there follows a legal and administrative process that can take years, shaped by prosecution timelines, forensic investigation, and negotiated pleas, not by the immediate aftermath of an attack. Only once that process concluded and Geiss's role in Bulger's death was formally established through indictment and eventual guilty plea, did the Bureau of Prisons move him into a facility where inmates never share a cell, never cross paths during movement, and are never left unsupervised in any capacity. Whatever access or capability had once allowed him to reach one of the most infamous informants in organized crime history now ends permanently at the walls of his own concrete cell. Yates proved that a life sentence and a high security placement were not enough to stop a determined killer inside the system. ADX Florence exists for whatever comes after that proof is established in court. Case number 10. Lawrence Bittaker.
I opened the door to the cage and he was in there uncuffed, and then they padlocked the door and walked away and left me with him. I just thought, this is where I die. This is how I die. He's going to kill me. And he is a lot bigger than he looks. He looks like a little old man in photos and in the documentary that I saw, but he was a lot bigger and stronger. And I was terrified.
The case that would become known as the Toolbox Killers did not break because of a discovery in the woods. It broke because one of the two men involved could not stop talking about what he had done. In late 1979, Roy Norris described the killings in detail to a friend from an earlier stint in prison, and that friend, shaken by what he heard, went to police. Detectives connected the account to an earlier surviving assault victim who had identified Norris and his accomplice from mugshots and described their van. And on November 20th, 1979, both men were arrested within hours of each other. Norris on a parole violation, and Bittaker at a motel in Burbank on a rape charge tied to that same surviving victim. Lawrence Bittaker was born on September 27, 1940, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and given up for adoption at birth. He committed his first burglary as a teenager and drifted in and out of the California prison system through his 20s and 30s on a string of theft and assault convictions, where an intelligence that colleagues and later evaluators described as well above average did nothing to slow an escalating criminal record. He met Roy Norris while both men were incarcerated at the California Men's Colony, a state prison in San Luis Obispo, and the two discovered they shared the same violent fantasies about kidnapping and torturing young women. After their release on parole, Bittaker in October 1978 and Norris 3 months later in January 1979, the two reconnected and bought a van specifically chosen for its sliding door, which made it easier to pull a victim quickly inside. They nicknamed it Murder Mac and stocked it with a toolbox of pliers, an ice pick, a sledgehammer, and wire coat hangers. Then spent the early months of 1979 driving stretches of the Pacific Coast Highway and the mountains above Los Angeles to identify isolated spots where they could take their victims unseen. When police searched Bittaker's motel room and impounded his van after his arrest, they found Polaroid photographs of two of the missing girls, a police scanner, and physical evidence tying him directly to the killings, along with jewelry taken from the victims as keepsakes. Between June and November 1979, Bittaker and Norris kidnapped 5 teenage girls off the streets and roadsides of the Los Angeles area, several of them hitchhiking when the van pulled over. 16-year-old Lucinda Schaefer was killed first, in June, followed by 18-year-old Andrea Hall in July. In September, the two men abducted 15-year-old Jacqueline Gilliam and 13-year-old Leah Lamp together and killed them the same day. Their final victim, 16-year-old Shirley Ledford, was abducted at the end of October. They drove their victims into the San Gabriel Mountains along a fire road they had scouted and rehearsed on in advance, where they raped and tortured them. In Ledford's case, recording nearly the entire assault on a cassette tape that would later be played for a Los Angeles County jury, driving several jurors, courtroom staff, and even the prosecutor to tears, with some spectators forced to leave the room. 2 of the 5 victims, Schaefer and Hall, were never found. Norris led investigators to the skeletal remains of Gilliam and Lamp in the mountains in February 1980 and pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of 45 years to life rather than death, agreeing to testify against Bittaker. Bittaker refused to cooperate and was convicted on all 26 counts against him, including 5 counts of murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of rape and sodomy, and sentenced to death in March 1981. He was admitted to San Quentin's death row 8 days later. Once inside, staff found him unnervingly calm and cooperative compared to more openly volatile inmates on the row, a demeanor that intelligence reports suggested only reinforced his standing among other violent prisoners rather than diminishing it. FBI profiler John Douglas, who studied the case as part of his research into violent offenders, later described Bittaker as among the most disturbing subjects he had ever encountered, citing not the violence itself, but the total absence of any emotional register around it. Norris, for his part, became eligible for parole after 30 years under his plea agreement and was denied at his hearings in the years that followed, remaining in custody at a separate facility until his own death. B. Taker spent nearly 40 years on death row, giving a series of interviews late in life to a criminologist researching the case and reportedly suffering a series of heart attacks in his final months, before dying of natural causes inside San Quentin on December 13, 2019, at age 79, without ever expressing remorse for the 5 girls he and Norris killed. Norris himself died 2 months later, in February 2020, at a separate California prison, having spent his sentence at a facility roughly 90 miles from where his former partner had been held. That's Prison Files. Tell us in the comments which case or which facility you want opened next.